There were 20,000 children in Quebec who were officially declared mentally defective. Many of them were not orphans. Some still had living parents. Some had never been examined by a single doctor. And yet, over the course of 11 years, entire orphanages quietly became psychiatric hospitals, almost overnight. I came to this through a wall in the records. I was tracing state-run children's institutions in North America, cross-referencing with the orphan train networks I looked at in an earlier investigation, and somewhere around Quebec, 1949, the names just stop. Children appear in one registry and disappear from another. No adoption, no death record, no discharge. They move from one administrative category into another. And the second category is permanent psychiatric patient. I want you to understand what that means before I tell you how it happened. Imagine you place your child somewhere, temporarily because you have no other option. You pay what you can, you visit when you can, and then one day you come back and they tell you your child is mentally defective. A doctor said so. The paperwork is filed. There is no appeal process written into the law. There is no review board. There is no second opinion required. And the institution that signed the form is the same institution that benefits financially from keeping your child classified as a patient. That is not a hypothetical. That is what happened to thousands of families in Quebec between 1949 and 1962. And here is what's strange. I still didn't know why, until I found the letter. And officially, none of this was supposed to look criminal. Duplessis won 4 elections. Many institutions run by the Catholic Church genuinely help children who had no other options. This is true, and I'm not discarding it, which is exactly why what happened inside those buildings stayed invisible for so long. Her name was Clarina Duval. She was 9 years old in 1948. Her mother had died in childbirth with a younger sibling. Her father worked in a lumber camp 6 months of the year. He placed Clarina in St. Julien, a Catholic orphanage outside Quebec City. He paid what he could. He visited when he could. In 1950, the orphanage became a psychiatric hospital. Clarina became a patient. She did not know this had happened. Her father did not know this had happened. The document certifying her as mentally deficient was signed by a Dr. Alphonse Couture. Clarina never met Dr. Couture. His written assessment was 14 words. Child presents behavioral difficulties consistent with mild intellectual deficiency. That was the medical examination. 14 words, 1 signature. She would spend the next 11 years in that building. The law that made this possible was Quebec's Mental Diseases Act of 1925. 1 doctor, 1 signature, no review, no observation period, no consent required. Dr. Alphonse Couture appears on 312 reclassification forms in 1950 alone. In many of those cases, the children were never physically present at the signing, but the law said his signature was sufficient. And so it was. The law explained how they could do it. It did not explain why thousands of children suddenly became psychiatric patients at the exact same time. For that, I had to find what happened to the money. And this is where the records stop looking like paperwork. In 1950, the Federal Hospital Insurance and Diagnostic Services Act established a per-bed subsidy structure. Orphanages received $1.25 per child per day. Psychiatric hospitals received $2.75. The math was not complicated. The moment I saw those two numbers together, I went looking for the paper trail. And I found it. It's in the Quebec National Archives. A letter dated March 14, 1949, from the office of the Minister of Health to the Superior of the Sisters of Mercy, who administered several of the converting institutions. The letter describes the reclassification process in these exact words: a practical administrative solution to the current funding structure. A practical administrative solution. Someone wrote those words. Someone typed them. Someone signed them. And then someone filed them in a manila folder in a provincial archive, where they sat for 40 years. The 1997 Quebec Government Commission, the Rapport Lauzon, found that between 1949 and 1962, 3,500 children at Saint-Julien alone were reclassified without individual examination. Certifying documents signed in batches, a single physician signing hundreds of forms in a single day. That's not medicine. That's a quota. The phrase, "could not determine whether destruction was deliberate or administrative," appears 4 separate times in the report, always around missing records. 4 times, always the same phrase, always around the same gap. But then I read what happened inside those buildings after the reclassifications. And this is where the story stops looking local. Former residents testified before the commission that children were used as subjects in pharmaceutical trials. The trials were conducted in cooperation with McGill University's Allen Memorial Institute. That name will mean something to some of you. The Allen Memorial Institute is the same institution in the same era where Dr. Ewan Cameron was running CIA-funded experiments in sensory deprivation and personality erasure on adult patients. The children's trials were separate, completely separate, at least in the documentation that has been released. But here is what I keep coming back to. The children who appeared in the pharmaceutical trial records were drawn from the same pool of reclassified patients. The institutions that ran the trials were connected to the same church administrative network that signed the reclassification letters. I don't know yet how far that connection goes. I have a name that appears in a child's reclassification record and in a university research protocol. That is the next investigation. What I can tell you is this. The children who were reclassified administratively and the children who appeared in pharmaceutical trial records, they overlap. It is not a coincidence. It is a pipeline. Then the system accelerated. 1942, first documented reclassifications. One institution. Quiet. 1949, the letter, the subsidy differential, the language of administration. 1952, Saint-Julien reclassified, all 600 children in 3 days. 1961, the federal subsidy structure changes, the financial incentive disappears. 1963, the last known batch reclassification. 11 years, 23 institutions, roughly 20,000 children. And that was only one provincial archive, the one that actually opened. This was not unique to Quebec. By the time investigators began comparing provincial archives, the same mechanism appeared across Canada: British Columbia, Manitoba, Ontario, 6 provinces total. In Ireland, the Ryan Commission of 2009 documented nearly identical per-head funding dynamics inside church-run industrial schools. Different country, different decade, different church. Nobody ordered the scheme to scale. It scaled itself, because wherever the same rate differential existed, the same incentive existed. It was not cruelty. It was indifference at scale. And indifference at scale is its own kind of cruelty. And here is what the children said under oath 20 years later when someone finally asked. The commission collected 3,000 sworn testimonies. Lucienne Landry said, "I did not know I was crazy. I was never crazy. I was told every day that I was crazy until I began to believe it." Yvette Bouchard said, "We called ourselves the Whitecoats. They made us wear the gowns even though we were children. I thought that's what children wore." Fernand Morin said, "The experiments were in the basement. You were taken there and brought back. You did not ask questions. You learned not to ask questions." These are not marginal accounts. They are in the public record. Rapport Lauzon, pages 87 through 219. In 1993, survivors held a press conference in Montreal. They called themselves the Duplessis Orphans. 3,000 people came to the first meeting. Some of them had never spoken about it publicly before. Some had never known there were others. They had spent decades believing the diagnosis, because when a government form says you are mentally defective and no one ever challenges it, and you grow up inside a system that treats you accordingly, the paperwork becomes your identity. They asked for 2 things: an apology and access to their files. The Quebec government apologized in 1999. The compensation was $3,000 per survivor, one-time payment, no medical coverage, no ongoing support, no acknowledgement that the lost years of education had any economic consequence. I want to be precise about that number. The federal government of Canada paid more than $3,000 per month in $1950 to keep a single reclassified child in a psychiatric bed. Over 11 years, that is more than $400,000 per child, adjusted for inflation. The survivors received $3,000. Once. The Catholic Church apologized in 2020, 70 years after the last batch reclassification. Some files were released. An unknown number of records were destroyed during the institutional closures of the 1960s and 1970s. The Commission found that some destruction occurred during building renovations, some during administrative transfers between the church and the provincial government, and some during a period when the institutions were being quietly wound down. The Commission could not determine whether any of this was deliberate.
They did find this. The records that survived are not randomly distributed. The files that remain are administrative and financial. The files that are missing are predominantly personal. The case histories, the medical assessments, the correspondence between families and institutions. The files that would allow you to trace what happened to a specific child are the ones most likely to be gone. The financial records survived intact. The children's records did not. Could not determine. Clarena Duval was released from St. Julien in 1961. She was 22 years old. She had no education past the 2nd grade, no vocational training, no identity documents. The institution had listed her as a permanent patient. She received $3,000. Nothing else. She died in 2008.
She is buried in the cemetery at the edge of the former St. Julien property, in an unmarked grave because the institution recorded her as indigent at discharge. Her name is in the open records now, but the name of the person who signed her reclassification, the person who wrote 14 words that defined 11 years of her life, that name is redacted. Not missing. Redacted. Soviet brutality was visible. It came with names and orders and sentences. There were perpetrators you could identify. The system had a face. This is something different. This is a democracy, a functioning welfare state, institutions built to protect the vulnerable, and a mechanism so quiet, so paper-thin, that it ran for 11 years before anyone connected the numbers. No one had to order it. No one had to intend it. The incentive structure did the work. Once the paperwork was easier than the alternative, the paperwork became the system. The paperwork was the weapon, and no one had to fire it. And there is the McGill connection, a name that appears in a child's reclassification record and in a university research protocol. I need more time with those files. If your family has any connection to these institutions, to St. Julien, to St. Jean de Dieu, to the Sisters of Mercy network in Quebec, write it in the comments, because some of the children in those records are still alive, and some of them may still believe the diagnosis.